did you come to the story of Mark O'Brien, and was it something that you immediately wanted to make into a feature film, or is that something that's taken a long time to process?
I came across it by wasting time surfing the internet, as one does. And I highly recommend that, because I stumbled quite accidentally on Mark O'Brien's article on seeing a sex surrogate. And it took me about 2 minutes to decide that I wanted that to be my next project. Like most of the best things that have happened to me, it was pure serendipity.
And he sent me out to work while he was writing it.
Which I also recommend.
One of the things that's incredibly admirable about the script is that you achieve a very emotional, very perfect emotional arc, and yet you're constantly balancing that with a terrific sense of humour. And I wondered what that process was like for you, writing with this material that is so meaningful and also so playful.
I think it probably arose out of just trying to find a voice for Mark O'Brien, and it was not a process of trying to be funny. In fact, there were moments, I remember the first screening at Sundance, and people laughed when Mark said, "Your money's on the desk over there." And that was an expression of his awkwardness and his total misunderstanding of who Cheryl was. And yet in the context, people found it funny. And I think that somehow the process of getting to know Mark as a character gave them permission to find that funny. And it was a revelation for me when I saw it with an audience to discover the humour in it. So I guess the secret of being humorous is not to try to be funny.
Judi, can I ask you about the challenges of getting a film like this made? Because in no person's book does this tickle the easy funding boxes.
It's not an easy sell, a movie about a disabled guy who wants to have sex with a lot of Catholicism. It took a little persuading, there was no question about that. And we realised that even with the best powers of persuasion, we couldn't get the conventional routes of financing for this film. We were rejected by the best, no question about that. And so at a certain point we came to the conclusion that if we were going to make this movie, we would have to find a way to finance it through our friends and family, basically. And so we just hit them up and said, we want you to invest in this movie and you don't have a choice. So
note to self.
Yeah, we have a lot of people to thank for that, actually, and all of the money is private investment, most of it from Australia and some of it from the US, and we felt very blessed in the end to have all of those people support us, despite their better judgment, some of them actually, but they're very happy now that they were part of this process.
And you have a terrific cast in our two leads here on the stage, and of course William H. Macy as well. Could you tell us how you brought them into the project and at what stage they became attached?
I think that one of the real unsung heroes or heroines of the business are the casting directors. And the very first thing we did when we had the budget together was find a casting director, and we were very fortunate to find one who really took this project to heart. And when she called me and said, just after John had got his Oscar nomination, this is your man, and he will give you more than any other actor will give you, I took her very seriously. It was was the first step in what became a bit of a runaway train, because once John was in the project, it attracted buzz around the agencies, and pretty soon there were people like Helen Hunt interested in working with us as well. And the runaway train didn't stop. I really felt like this was not quite real, because we'd never envisaged a cast like that. And I must say that for the most part, when we were filming, I sat back and watched the best theatre in the world, and while the actors did the heavy lifting, I took the credit.
John, I'll ask you about the role and the sort of research that you did into it. I imagine it's a very physically demanding role, even though that might not necessarily come across. Could you tell us a little bit about how you prepared for it? And also, I'm very interested to know whether you watched, there's a very wonderful documentary about Mark O'Brien by Jessica Yu called Breathing Lessons. Was that part of your research for the role?
Yes, Jessica Yu's film Breathing Lessons was a wonderful tool for me. Normally, in a role like this, if it were fiction, I would have to invent a great deal. Mark left, in addition to his poetry and journalism and essays, an autobiography called How I Became a Human Being. So there was what you'd call a backstory right there that I didn't have to invent. Jessica Yu's film Breathing Lessons showed Mark in the flesh. There was his voice, all things that I would have, again, had to invent, but instead was able to study and try and emulate. I like being specific as an actor, and there were some very specific details that I was able to lift from watching Jessica's movie. I also wanted to really emulate Mark and capture the Mark that I saw in her short film, because I'd hoped that those who survived Mark, who might see the film, would see as much of their friend or relative in what I'd done as possible. On the physical side, for preparation, there was learning to type with a mouth stick and turn pages of a book, and to make telephone calls. I practiced that at home. It's mentioned a couple of times that Mark's spine is horribly curved, and so to that end, I conceived of and helped design a soccer ball-sized piece of firm foam that I placed midway under the left side of my back to give an approximation of Mark's spinal curve. And from the film and from Mark's autobiography, Mark speaks about each part of his body, and I tried to emulate his twisted frame as best I could. So that was the physical side, yes.
And Helen, congratulations on a performance that I just think is, very brave and also very free and natural. And I wondered if you could tell us about how, firstly, what attracted you to the role, and then how you prepared for it.
Brave means naked. I know that now. But thank you. The thing that attracted me was the script. You finish a script, and once in a long while, you close the last page and say, "That's beautiful. I want to be in that." And so I had breakfast with Ben and left there thinking, I hope I'm asked, and then I was asked.
And what sort of preparation did you do once you were cast in the role?
I didn't think that speaking to the real Cheryl would necessarily be helpful. It was a very different circumstance. She's still with us, and I didn't feel the same obligation to be like her, but I didn't know what to do. So I thought, well, I'll call her and I'll talk to her for an hour, and like it usually is when you play a real person, it probably won't be as helpful as one would think, but very quickly I had my own little aha moment, big aha moment, from the information she gave me, but much more from her way of being. I thought, boy, if somebody that enthusiastic and frank and loud and wide open in terms of her heart and her spirit, and if that walked through the door with sex in mind, I haven't seen that. And that seemed like it would be really scary for him, and I just know reading the movie, by then we're supposed to be in his head, and we are, so something that's at first scary and then becomes soothing is probably right for the story, so that was sort of my windy path.
It's an interesting question, and I never asked it. I know that Mark did write her poetry. When someone asked me what was the moment that affected me most in the film, I think I spontaneously said the moment where she kissed his chest. Now that's literally out of his own writing, that moment and his reaction to it. And it was not to do with mechanical sex. It was something quite unexpected for him and probably for Cheryl as well. Now, whether you call that a moment of love or what you call it, it certainly was a big step on his path to emotional connection. And I sent the script to Cheryl to get her feedback, and her comments were never directed at what was the emotional temperature between her and Mark, because I think it was impossible to define. What I was trying to convey, and which I think Helen hit the note absolutely perfectly, is that the profession of sex surrogacy, whilst on the one hand makes a lot of sense, I mean, the logic that they used was talking about serious sexual issues is about as effective as teaching someone to drive by giving them a book about motor cars. And this went that step further. However, the downside of that is it is a tightrope act to be physically involved with your client, to care about the client, which is the major purpose of the exercise, as opposed to prostitution, and at the same time avoid personal connection. And I think Cheryl walked this tightrope all her career. And I wanted to express that dilemma in the relationship with Mark. And I think it was the appropriate thing to do. I never actually asked Cheryl, did you fall in love with him? I didn't want to know. But she understood that for the purposes of this story, it did express the complex nature of being a sex surrogate, that you do open your emotions and you do become vulnerable. I've no doubt that Mark fell in love with her. Pretty much, yes. We did things in long takes and by and large in very few takes. And I think that, I mean, it's probably useful to tell you that we really didn't rehearse in the conventional way. That the first time you see Helen's character undressing John's character, that's the first time it happened. And she really did sweat on it, and I think, you know, the spontaneity of the moment was part of the energy of the scene.
I don't know. I do know that Cheryl Cohen-Green and Susan Fernbach, who Mark meets at the end of the film, portrayed by Robin Weigert in our movie, and Jessica Yu, who made the film that we'd mentioned about Mark, Breathing Lessons, have all seen the film. Also, at random screenings, I've met people who knew Mark as well. I doubt any of them would come up and say, you fell flat on your face. That sucked. You were awful. But they've all been very, very kind. I know that in Jessica Yu's case, and I hope she wouldn't mind me saying, she was extremely emotional after seeing the film in Sundance for minutes, 5 or 10 minutes afterwards. Was very emotional and told me something that made me very happy when she said it was like spending 100 minutes with her old friend Mark, and she was thankful for that. So that was a good
We
thing.
did show the film actually to a disabled group in Berkeley, in California, and amongst the audience were quite a few old friends of Mark, and I think they were similarly moved by the portrayal.
And Susan Fernbach and Cheryl Cohen-Green, the two real women, were on set with us, and both of them audibly gasped the first time they heard John playing the character of Mark because they felt that they could close their eyes and imagine that Mark was in the room with them. John did such an extraordinary job of recreating Mark's presence in that space. So we feel that everybody that we know who was associated with Mark has felt that John has done more than any of us could have ever expected.
Mark didn't talk about his family in any significant way in his article on seeing a sex surrogate, and I must say that I really used that as a blueprint for the movie.
We agree. It's a universal subject. Everybody in this room has probably experienced the same sort of awkwardness and anxiety that Helen and John portray so beautifully on the screen. It's definitely something that goes beyond just sex and disability. I think someone just told me recently that there was a survey that said that most 20-year-olds have more anxiety about sex than anything else. So I think it's something that definitely goes beyond just what Mark was experiencing in that room. More and more for everybody.
In Sweden, Helen told me, this film has a G rating,
That's what I was
so 10-year-olds can see it, and I believe in Denmark they're making it compulsory. I must say that we finally relented and allowed our 12-year-old daughter to see it. And knowing that we were looking for a new title, she suggested Full Penetration. It's a character directly out of Mark's article, and I guess one of the points at which I really did a double take was when I read that bit when he said that he felt he needed the blessing of his priest to do this. I found out that he was a very devout Catholic, that church was a regular part of his routine, and I didn't know this particular priest, but it wasn't hard to imagine a kind of a hippie priest in Berkeley at that time who was profoundly humanitarian and who at the same time was not bound by dogma. I really think that Bill Macy was a total natural. I think secretly he wants to be a priest. I really have to give him credit for giving the part such nuance, and by doing so much with so little sometimes. And we had enormous fun really kind of slightly rewriting the part here and there. I must say that the days we spent in church filming those scenes almost turned me into a God-fearing man.
An accent, yeah. I'm not one of those Meryl Streepy people who can do anything with her accent. I don't know how that happens, but I'm like an elbow grease person. It takes a lot of time and work for me. So I had a dialect coach that I worked with that I liked a lot. I've worked with him many times. And then I made Cheryl read every line into a tape recorder and listen to that over and over and over and over. So that was it for me.
Well, again, Jessica Yu's film was really my template for Mark's voice, and I think perhaps the device that I'd mentioned, lying on, might have helped to bring that voice forth. But I just dubbed the audio out of her movie and listened to it incessantly. As I drove to work, I would listen to it and speak along with it. And in between takes, I would drag out the trusty Walkman CD player and put on headphones and listen to try to make sure I was on the right track. And driving home afterwards, I would listen to it again. The point for me is to try to make all of the physical side of a character like this so second nature, so inherent to my body, so in my bones that I don't think about it at all and just hope that what's coming out is correct. I know in Jessica's movie, Mark's voice was, his dialect was the same, but the timbre of his voice, even the pitch, the music of his voice was different from scene to scene depending on how tired he was. So I felt I had a little bit of leeway. But in doing the voiceovers, I asked Ben, is this Mark after he has died, and should he have a tiny bit more control over his voice? And we wrestled with that, but ultimately I think tried to keep it fairly consistent. But there you go.